Topic, slope flight.
Okay, hello again, everyone. Can you guys hear me okay without the microphones? Okay. All right, that's better. So my name is Scott Lawson. I just joined. It's the slow flight. I just joined Civil Air Patrol last summer, and I wish I would have done it a lot sooner. I'm actually retired active duty Air Force. I served about 28 years as I was an airborne linguist, so I got to fly a lot in the back of planes, but I never dreamed of actually being a pilot. So I started flying about 5 years ago. And then I joined Civil Air Patrol last year, and it's just such a great community of professionals and knowledge, and I'm just really humbled to be here and to be able to soak up all the knowledge from all the pilots in the room, and hopefully I can impart a little bit of my knowledge that I've gained on you. So my topic is slow flight, and
Mike close to you now.
so there we go. Okay, so my topic is, that sounds weird hearing my own voice on the speaker. My topic is slow flight, and what I realized preparing for that this week, I mean, I've gone through all these lessons and you practice it and everything, but it really accounts for a lot of what we do as pilots. It's actually like everything in between. We talked about stabilized approaches and landing. It's kind of everything in between cruise flight and when we're landing. So it really accounts for a very important part of our flight training and our safety. And I can see why it was selected as a topic for this. So technically, any speed less than cruise speed, but for training purposes, when we train and when we evaluate this, we fly at a speed. Any increased angle of attack, load factor, or power reduction will cause an immediate stall. So the objective is to understand the slow flight characteristics, how the aircraft performs near the critical angle of attack. And it requires precise control of the airplane and airspeed. It's critical when operating close to the ground and in the region of reverse command. So there's just a little visual that's out of the PHAC. So we're low airspeed, high angle of attack, high power setting at constant altitude. Next slide. Oh, and it works. So those circles moved on me. I used some of the same stats presented earlier by Lee Roberts. And he kind of set this up very well, talking about his stabilized approaches and landings. This is from the most recent Joseph T. Mao report. It's published on AOPA. And if you look at this, you can summarize that 80% of accidents are caused or related to some form of slow flight. So that's in landing, takeoff, descent approach, and maneuvering. We're always somehow we're close to that slow flight. So that's why it's very important for us to understand these concepts. Any questions on this or discussion? And really what I want to do is I'm going to briefly go through the different concepts of slow flight. We'll talk about power settings. We're going to go through load factors, weight, some of the things that were hit on before, center of gravity, some of the senses, maneuvering during slow flight. But the last part I want to get into is this discussion on a recent article. Oh, that's okay. A recent discussion that I saw on practicing in ground effect and doing centerline slow flight. And it's something that I only had one CFI introduced to me in my training, but I thought it was very valuable. And as I read this, I'm like, why don't we do that more often? And it's something that I plan on doing as a CFI. And I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are and what your experiences are. So, is that you or me? Okay. So, power and slow flight. As we know as pilots, when we're flying in slow flight, we're in the region of reverse command. So normally, if we're in cruise flight, if we want to go a little faster, we're going to add power. But we're in that area of reverse command, it's going to be the opposite. So what are we doing to change our airspeed or change our altitude when we're in that area of reverse command?
Decrease the angle of attack.
Right. So we're yeah, and then we talk about controllability. So we've got increased power at slower airspeeds and at a higher angle of attack. And it's also going to increase our left turning tendencies And then we have to anticipate more right rudder to maintain that coordination. Okay, load factors that Craig mentioned earlier. When we're already flying at slow flight, whenever we're in a turn, what is that going to do to our stall speed? Right, so we got a higher load factor, it's going to increase that stall speed. So we got to be very sensitive to that when we're already in a slow setting, slow environment. If we're going to be in a turn, it's got to be a nice, gentle turn for that. If we try and do something too aggressive, we're already there and we're approaching that accelerated stall, or can get ourselves into a stall very quickly. So gentle turn, gentle low bank turns, and then keeping that coordination.
But it looks like anything up to about a 20-degree turn, you can't really even tell.
Right.
The load factor has changed.
Right. It's very minimal up to here, but then once. Why is that doing that? Correct. Once you get past 20 degrees, then you're going to start noticing that effect.
Don't be afraid of 20 degrees. You can't even tell the difference.
Okay, and then weight and slow flight. So the heavier we are, it's going to require a higher angle of attack necessary, and that's going to put us closer to our stall speed again. So it can be more stable. That increased weight and stability can assist in controlling the aircraft, but it's also going to require a higher angle of attack, and that's going to put us closer to our stall speed. So we need to be aware of that. Center of gravity, forward-loaded aircraft, it's going to act heavier. So again, we're going to get a higher angle of attack, closer to our stall speed. And then if it's aft loaded, we might, it's going to act lighter, might be a little faster, lower the angle of attack. So we'll have a lower stall speed, but it's going to be more difficult to recover from a stall when we get in that situation. And the idea here is that we learn these concepts to fly at slow flight, because what's just on the other side of slow flight if we don't catch it?
Oh.
Right. So if we can master these skills and fly comfortably in slow flight and catch that, we're kind of in the zone, and we don't ever get to that stall situation. Okay, and then these are just some of the senses that you might encounter. I'm sure you've all experienced this in your training. So you're going to be nose high. You're going to see a lot of sky. You might not be able to see the ground. It's going to get a little quieter until you start getting that engine back in. And then your flight controls. How are the flight controls when you get into slow flight? Really, really kind of soft, mushy. You're feeling like somebody's maybe grabbing your tail and moving you around a little bit. And then you're going to need a lot more right rudder, because of all that, the P factor and some of the power tendencies that Craig mentioned in his briefing. Okay. And then maneuvering. So as we set up for this, we're going to pitch for our airspeed. Well, these are just some of the maneuvers that we'll do while we're in slow flight. So if we're too fast, we're going to pitch up. And if we're too slow, we're going to pitch down. So we're going to pitch for our airspeed, small, controlled changes, 1 to 2 degrees at a time. And then as we change our airspeed, we might have to adjust our power as well. If we're changing our altitude, it's going to be just the opposite. Slow flight, we're going to have to actually add power if we want to increase our altitude, and if we want to descend, we're going to have to pull that power back. When we're doing the maneuver, we're going to maintain a selected heading. And then we'll do those level turns, and you can practice climbing and descending turns. So keep these concepts in mind and practice these when you go out. Deliberately practice slow flight when you go out, especially when you're doing your proficiency profiles. How many of you practice slow flight deliberately every time you go out? That's great.
Every time you do for me.
Well, that's true. I wasn't trying to get you there, but I'm asking, do you go out and do you actually like configure yourselves and put yourself in slow flight? And that's something I've learned just in my limited experience. As an instructor, I started doing checkouts for people in our aircraft or our club. And that's one of the maneuvers, we go through basically a mini flight review with them. And, you can just kind of tell if they can manage the aircraft at slow flight, they got a pretty good handle on the controls, the airspeed, and how to keep everything in check. All right, so this is the topic that I kind of wanted to get into and just elicit a discussion. And I think that was the intent of this whole thing, was to cover the concepts, but then let's talk about how we implement these things in civil air patrol to make ourselves safer pilots. So this was a recent Society of Aviation and Flight Educators article that I found. Actually just came out last week or a couple of weeks ago, so it's very timely. And the point that they were making was that every CFI needs to be comfortable with centerline slow flight, and it should be part of every normal student syllabus. And as I said, I only encountered this once in my training. No other CFI took the time to show it to me, but it was very eye-opening for me to have to fly the plane down the runway, centerline, and ground effect, not land, but just maintain that control, 3 to 5 feet off the ground. And it was really kind of surprising how much that improved my skills to be able to manage that aircraft, because landing for a student pilot is kind of like the candy, to give them, to keep them motivated. And it seems like a lot of when you're first doing your instruction, that's kind of the goal, is to teach them how to get that landing in, to get that motivation. But this concept kind of goes the other way, and the emphasis is more on getting them the fundamentals, teaching them how to do that slow flight, control the aircraft, and incrementally bring them down into the pattern where they can do that slow flight over the runway, centerline, and then you introduce the landing after that. So this is where I really wanted to open up kind of a discussion and hear your thoughts on that, your experiences, and how you practice that. Yes?
So, I can create.
Yeah, if you want to.
Talk about this, but this is very good for introducing sight picture for landing. In fact, I was struggling with the student. They were flaring too high, like what if I'm sure what to do? So I called Craig, and as a DP, he had a tricks to provide. This was one. He said that get him to fly down just above, fly down the runway, center line, also, and work your way down on subsequent towers, and then eventually they will find that they made the softest of landings. No surprise, but it teaches them not just a slow flight, but it teaches them the right sight picture for landing.
Yeah, it makes total sense, and it's funny you mention that, because in the article it concluded with saying that it's often only introduced like as a last resort when somebody just can't figure it out, to come back and kind of bring them back and correct them. But this is suggesting we do that up front before we even introduce the landings to them. Yes, Craig?
Scott already covered it. Yeah, if they're having trouble on landings, make them fly 5 feet above the runway at approach speed, then make them fly 3 feet above the runway, then 1 foot above the runway.
Mm-hmm.
You might start off, okay, you control the elevator, you as the CFI might control the power so that they stay on speed, but work them down a few feet at a time and tell them, do not land, do not land, do not touch down, do not land. And if you get them down to a foot above the runway in slow flight, they'll get 5 of the very nicest landings you've ever seen.
Yeah.
On one pass down the runway.
Yes, Lee.
I would sometimes do a similar exercise with students. Generally at an airport with a larger runway, wider, no traffic preferably. And I would start them down the runway, not from an approach, but just kind of a high-speed taxi. And I would control the power and bring it up to like 1,700, 1,800 RPM, and just have them kind of a soft build takeoff technique and just kind of hovering ground effect. Doing the same thing, just kind of being comfortable with the rudder and the ailerons and elevator controls, just right there in ground effect. And I had the same experience. Usually after 2 or 3 passes down the runway doing that, they had it figured out.
Yeah, I think that's a great technique, and I plan on using that. I haven't had any primary students yet. I've got one coming up, and I plan on doing that with him, is following this technique that they recommend. The other thing that, from what I've read and what I would recommend, we talked about stabilized approaches, is make them earn that landing. And if there's anything that's off and they're not getting it and they're not correcting early on, they have to do a go around. And that's how they learn to do go arounds too, is, you know, if you're not set up for it, just get that as part of the pattern. So it's almost automatic. Okay, I'm not stabilized. I'm not looking good. I'm just going to go around. It's not a big deal. There's no shame. And then they can come back if they've got everything right, then they land. If they have to go around 2 or 3 times, it's still part of the training. You got to learn how to do go arounds, right? So someone else had a comment back here? Vern?
I actually agree with what Ron said. When I've had students before and they come in and start, they keep their focus on where they're going to land, and they just don't look down the runway. They'll always veer off one way or the other. When they start doing that, I'll take them back to this procedure and have them focus on the end of the runway, so that when they come into flare, they're not focusing on the runway they're going to land on. They're focusing down the runway to the end of the center line every time.
Yes, Lance?
I can't remember the name of the author, but in the book Stick and Rudder, he points out that in most flight training, except what we've been talking about here, in most flight training, most students encounter slow flight for about a half a second. And it's during the flare, and they don't learn how to fly in that realm. And even just starting about at altitude 1,000 feet and just flying slow flight for a long period of time just helps out. And then you can take them down to the ground effect.
That's great. Anyone else have any comments on that? Experiences that they want to share?
So this whole concept is kind of something I've been trying to do a lot when teaching. Is there's a lot of different areas of flying where we tend to just go up, practice a maneuver, like okay, we're going to do a steep turn. It's going to be 360 degrees at 40 degrees of the bank, right? So that turn in sometimes, right, might be a trouble spot for somebody, but they're only practicing that for a couple of seconds. So what I've tried to do as instructor is like find those parts where they only get a little bit of exposure and find ways to prolong it. In the case of steep turns, I might make them do maybe a 30-degree turn to the left, like heading wise, and just go back and forth. They're practicing rolling. For this, it's practicing slow flight, practicing that time when they're just about touched down to the so finding those different ways where you can prolong exposure of trouble spots, I think can be really helpful.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is just the whole idea of this is, to me, this is like a great transitional skill to integrate. It's part of almost every maneuver that we do. So if you can master that slow flight, doing the, practicing the stalls and everything else, the landings, it's all gonna come together a lot nicer. Anyone else? Anyone online have anything? Okay. I think that was it. I might have just had a conclusion slide. Can you advance that?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was it. So like we said, work on this skill. I challenge you to integrate with into your training. I did have one more question.
Craig Hansen raised his hand.
Okay.
Craig, go ahead.
I was trying to follow this, and I just wondered how you get into the slow flight going down a runway a few feet above the runway. Do you start landing and then not land, or do you start taking off and not take off?
Yeah, basically, you're just going to set up your landing configuration, stabilize approach, but you're not going to land. You're going to go down into ground effect, or that's the goal, is to work yourself where you can get down into ground effect, and you're just going to follow along the runway. And if you're 3 to 5 feet off, if something does go wrong, it's pretty easy to convert that into a landing if you need to, or you can do the go around. But I think it's a great practice to be able to maintain that control and get really comfortable in that slow flight configuration. Did you have something else, Greg?
In check rides, especially commercial check rides, slow flight is probably the toughest thing a commercial pilot will do, because they've got a 5-knot window in speed, minus 0 plus 5, that's tight. And they've got a 50-foot altitude window to work with. And I see way too many applicants get set on their altitude, and then they pull throttle way, way back and start slowing down. And then when they get down to their target speed or close to it, they start adding power back in, and by the time they get up to the requisite power, they've lost
Too far behind.
Right? Keep in mind that once you get below VY, it's going to take more power to go slower. So know what the VY is for your airplane. Once you get below that, you need to start increasing power. In fact, if you've gone out and practiced this and you know what that power setting is, just wait till you get to VY, set the power setting, and be patient. The slower it gets, the draggier it'll get. The draggier it'll get, the slower it gets. And when drag matches thrust, you're there. Don't be in a hurry. But if you ever lose 50 feet in slow flight, you don't have enough power to get it back.
Right, too far behind. But that's a great place to realize what happens when you get behind like that, and not in the pattern, not when you're doing that approach.
Dennis Malloy said, hopefully go-arounds have been practiced well before this maneuver.
Good point. Yes.
You're going to be hearing during your slow flight practice experiences that stall warning coming on periodically.
Right.
I think it's very important that the student recognize that stall warning on it and react to it rather than allowing that thing to continue to glare during your slow flight, because you don't want to desensitize a student of that stall warning, that audible alarm, and the controls feel during that period of time.
Right.
Because they're really sloppy, it takes a lot of power to recover. You want to be maybe where that stall warning worm is just chirping at that stage. They're aware that it's going on, rather than ignoring it or becoming desensitized to that stall warning.
Yeah, thank you. Good point. One other question I have is, we do have some student pilots in the audience, right? What has your experience been with slow flight, and how much of a part of the training has it been for you with your instructors? Anybody care to share that? Or we don't have any student pilots?
You do, but they
No, we
probably.
don't.
Yeah, I won't pick on you guys. You already got put on the spot early on, so,
Have you had slow flight practice?
Yeah,
okay.
I'm not a student pilot, but I was once, and just a silly little memory device. I mean, this was a lot of years ago that this happened. And I remember my primary flight instructor teaching me slow flight, and he pointed to my hand on the throttle and he said, "Greg, this is your elevator button. You know, go up, go down. This is your elevator button," touching the back of my hand. And that was a really, really good memory device for me to realize that in that reverse command area, throttle up, throttle back, or down. Elevator button.
That's a good way to remember it. Yes?
One of the things that I like to point out to the students in slow flight is that in slow flight, everything happens slow. And one of the things that I see a lot is people overthinking in slow flight. And if you look at the instrument flying handbook, it talks about the standard rate change calculation. It's half, what is it?
15% of your airspeed.
Yeah, 15%. So basically it works out to about, if you're at 50 knots, it works out to about 12 degrees back. You should never be more than 15 degrees back in slow flight.
Anything else you want to add, Craig? You look like you're thinking.
15 is a good rule. 20 won't hurt you. They're
Right.
real.
Yeah, once you get past that, then you can get in trouble really fast. So, all right. Well, with that, how much time do I have left?
You've
6
got
minutes.
6.5 minutes.
Okay.
Give enough time,
You
that's
want to
okay.
dance for us?
I'm gonna kind of, I'll skip the dance. It's too early for that. I'll give back those 6 minutes and thank you all for listening. Hope you learned something from the discussions, and I hope this is something we can take back as pilots and CFIs to integrate into our training. Yes?
What language?
I was a Korean linguist. I always say I knew enough to get in trouble, but not enough to get out. So that was my only job in the Air Force for the entire 28 years. I mean, I did a lot of other roles too, but that was my only specialty. So.
Somebody got.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hey, we're doing great on time. Good job to all of you. Next presenter is Scott May, going to talk to us about stalls.
Is there a reason that comes after slow flight?
Yes,
I'll let Scott.
Yes, there is a
Scott
reason.
address that.
Okay.
Yeah, first off, I'm sure this is the most anticipated
It's a mic.
briefing.
Mic.
Scott,
Right.
Scott, move that up to your mouth.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. You're a really quiet speaker.
Okay, so this is the most anticipated briefing of the day, right?
Yes.
Yes. Quit stalling.
All right, so is there anything else we'd like to be doing on a Saturday morning than briefing stalls?
Let's go. Let's do it. Okay.
So actually, in answer to someone's question, is there any reason why stalls come after slow flight? Well, if you remember, Scott mentioned that if you slow down too much in slow flight, what comes next? I think we're your exact words. So stalls come next. Okay, so yeah, it's kind of a boring topic. Kind of like slow flight might be, kind of like steep turns might be. But I'm trying to make this into a bit of a practical perspective. Thanks. All right, which button?
The one on the right.
The one that's worn off. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so I've tried to make this into a practical perspective, but I'm going to go into a little bit of theory and numbers. So for those of you who like it, good. For those of you who don't, just be patient. We'll get past them quickly. And you might find that they've already been discussed. So I might be able to give you a little bit more time back. Thanks to Craig and Scott. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about stalls. We're going to define stalls. We're going to talk about how they're related to the critical angle of attack, some situations that you have to be cognizant of, or else you will end up in a stall. We're going to eliminate some of those situations and focus on turning stalls, which are actually, like Craig said, accelerated stalls. And then we're going to talk about how to avoid those as a CAP mission pilot, not just how to avoid them as a private pilot, as an FAA pilot, but as a CAP mission pilot. That's the practical perspective of today. Okay, this is the audience participation time. So what is a stall?
Loss of lift.
Loss of lift, okay, good. Something else? Paul?
Angle of attack.
Good.
Simply.
Okay, anything else?
Disrupted airflow.
Good. There's usually one more thing that comes up.
Hopefully not a surprise.
Something related to speed, that they're all part of the definition. A rapid decrease in lift caused by the separation of airflow from the wing surface brought on by exceeding the critical angle of attack. Okay? Good definition. The stall, though, can occur at any pitch, altitude, or airspeed. Doesn't mean you have to be slow, which is kind of one of the possible misconceptions. But you could be fast. Airplane. Also, the wing does not totally stop producing lift. It just doesn't produce enough lift to keep you airborne, which is why we need to try to fly as light as possible. Because what it does is it lowers your stall speed. It's very important. And it'll come up later. Okay, so critical angle of attack, we talked about that. That's essentially when you get to the point where you get all those nasty things that you guys talked about. Right, you get the turbulent airflow, you get high deck angle, you get you don't have enough produced lift to keep you airborne. So that's what we consider critical angle of attack. For most general aviation airplanes, it tends to be at 15 to 20 degrees, 17, 18 degrees in this case. Okay, so that critical angle of attack leads to 3 situations that can result in stalls. At least what we'll talk about today. Low speed flying, high speed flying, and turning flight. Okay, low speed flying, yeah, we're kind of all used to this one. As airspeed decrease, the angle of attack has to increase or you're going to stall. So in order to maintain altitude, you have to increase the angle of attack. But if you let the angle of attack get too high or you let the speed get too low, then you exceed the critical angle of attack. Right, that's the normal standard scenario for stalls, low speed stalls. High speed stalls, different story. Right, so you don't have to be slow to stall. And your wing can be brought to excessive angle of attack at any speed. In fact, in this particular scenario, you've got an airplane. And Craig, you talked about this already. You got an airplane flying along in a low angle of attack. You got the center of gravity of the airplane that pretty much is flying along the same line as the relative wind. That's a definition of low angle of attack. You yank back on the stick, and what happens? Well, you yank back on the stick, say 150 knots in the Cessna, what happens? Yeah, well, first that'll happen. You get the nose to come up and your wings come off. Okay, so on the F-16, that's not likely to happen. The F-16 is designed for that, but the aerodynamic response is the same. Nose is going to come up to a pretty high angle of attack. The CG of the airplane is still following that flight path, which means the AOA is very high. Fortunately, in this case, the design and the thrust to weight ratio greater than 1 allows you to fly off and establish the new relative wind where your angle of attack is back to low. All right, so bottom line is you yank back on the stick. It's highly over.
Question on that. Going back to my private pilot days or student pilot days.
Oh, by the way, does this question come off of my time?
Yes.
Yes, it does. Nobody ever taught me these, and I'm not sure I know a real good way to teach them myself. What experience exists in the planes we fly to teach this concept?
So when I was doing initial CFI training at a university down south, I would ask my applicants, I want you to show me stall at 80 knots and show me no stall at 0 knots. They'd say, how can you do that? I'd teach them, I'd send them away to research this. Some of them would come back with reasonable answers. But we'd go out and fly a demo flight. This was in a Diamond DA-20 Katana. And I'd say, okay, let's do a no stall at 0 knots indicated. Now, stall speed is related to what in terms of loading? It's the square root of the load factor, okay? So if you've got 0 load factor, what's the stall speed? 0. So we pick up some speed, we fly a parabola, go up over the top, and at the top of that parabola, airspeed would be darn close to 0. But the airplane was not stalled. It was floating, but it was not stalled. Then we come back down the other side, and when we got up to approximately VA, a little bit less than VA, 5 knots less than VA, I'd do this with the stick. Punk! Tail would go down, the nose would come up, the airplane would violently shudder. The airspeed indicator was 80 knots, well above placarded stall speed. But the airplane was in a violent stall. Do not do this at low altitude.
Or above VA.
Or above VA. But that's an easy demonstration to do. No stall at 0 airspeed, violent stall at VA minus 10.
Probably shouldn't be in return either.
It wouldn't matter.
Accelerated.
All the aerodynamics involved in a turn
Still angle of attack.
it changes controllability.
Still angle of attack.
Does that answer your question?
I'll give you more time.
Okay.
Stall, aircraft will stall
before it does damage.
One axis.
Whether it's caused by this, or whether it's caused by only one axis. So I choose a roll axis.
I answered that about the damage. The reason an F-16 can pitch so violently and not break wings off is because it has a VA, its maneuvering speed is 400 knots. Okay? And even when it's unloaded, see, that airplane can carry quite a bit of bomb, but if it's unloaded and clean like this, that VA sits around 390, 400 knots. That's why it can pitch so violently. They normally fly at 380 knots.
It also has a load limit of 10.
They have much higher load limit, that's why they have 400 knots.
Yep.
We have a VA of 100 knots. That's why we can do that. If you're at 80 knots, yes, you can pull the stick all the way back. In fact, that maneuver right there where you pitch very violently, that's the entry maneuver for us, a snap roll. Watch aerobatic aircraft go out, they do that fun roll that's very fast, and they pitch them up and spin on. Basically a horizontal spin. And it's all in AOA. Everything's about AOA in this.
Yes, results of high AOA, AOA is potential stall. Okay, so you ready to move on? All right. Okay, so the third stall situation is a turning stall. We've talked a lot about this. So a turning stall, the stalling speed of an aircraft is higher in a level turn than in a straight level turn. And it's because you have to produce more lift. Like Craig said in his briefing, when you begin a turn, you got to pull back on the stick. But when you pull back on the stick, you're doing that because what you're doing is you're in need of more lift because you've got a vertical component of lift that counters the weight, and then you've got a horizontal component of lift that gets you into a turn. So if you sum the two forces, your total lift now is higher than the original lift you had, and that's countered by that load factor times the weight. So that load factor is what you're fighting against here. So what we find is that as you bank the airplane, the AOA requirement increases. And if you get that AOA too much, then you get into a turning area, a turning flight stall. Okay. So remember that graphic, you're going to see it again. All right, so in summary for the stall situations, stall speed at low flight is something we're all used to, something we all practice, something we all demonstrate on a Cat 4-5. High speed, well, that's something we don't normally deal with. General aviation aircraft weren't designed for that sort of thing. So some turning stalls that I think are probably least understood, and for that reason, it's going to consume the rest of the discussion here today. Okay, for those of you that like numbers, we'll go through them pretty quick. For those of you who don't, right, for straight level flight, the equation is lift equals a function of density, velocity squared, the planned form area of the wing, and a coefficient of lift. Weight equals mass times gravity, lift equals weight. So you put that all into a mixer, you solve for the V, which is a function of that square root term, and then you substitute the coefficient of lift for the maximum coefficient of lift. So beyond that, you stall the airplane, and you come up with the stall speed. That's how, in general, the stall speed of an aircraft is defined. You have that plus maybe some flight test. But when you introduce a turn, things change just a little bit, just a little bit. So what you get is lift is now, the total lift is now equal to the load factor times weight. So lift is also equal to mg times n. You put that back in that equation, you resolve, and you get the accelerated stall speed is a function of the stall speed times the square root of the load factor. I think that came up just a few minutes ago. All right, so most of us don't like these kinds of terms. We prefer graphs. It's hard to do mental math, especially in the cockpit, so this is what we prefer to see instead. So what we normally are taught as a private pilot is that you bank 60 degrees, you get 2 G's of load. So when you get 2 Gs of load, you take the square root of that load factor, and that's how you build that stall speed increase curve, right? So you notice that stall speed increases greatly throughout this bank angle increase where you increase the load of the airplane.
Go back to that.
I think so.
So take a close look. Where is 3.8 Gs? That's our airplane.
Well, all right, so 3.8 Gs, you said was 75 degrees of bank and 100-degree increase in stall speed. That's exactly what it is. I verified the numbers back there when you were talking.
Oh, okay. So let's keep our flying under 75 degrees of bank.
I think there's other reasons why we need to keep the angle of bank less than that. So we shouldn't have a problem with 75 degrees unless there's a significant emergency. Okay, so what does all this mean? What it means is turning stalls are generally accelerated stalls. Okay. Marilyn, you have I got a question.
No, it's good.
Okay.
I've just done some great lazy eights in my life.
You what?
I've done some fun lazy eights in my life.
Oh, okay, maybe you can share.
Not in a cap airplane.
There's a story behind this.
No, ask me later.
Okay. All right, so how much time do I have? Oh, I'm only halfway through.
15 minutes.
Sorry?
You're halfway through, you're right on.
Okay, good. Okay, so stalls that occur above 1 G. So anytime you can feel yourself getting sunk into that seat, you're experiencing accelerated flight, okay? So it's something to look out for. Whenever you're getting pushed into your seat, you should be really cognizant about the potential for turning stalls. So accelerated stalls are, like I said, caused by turning. They can also be caused by pulling too hard on the yoke, all right? We talked about the scenario with the F-16, all right? If we pull hard at 150 knots, that's the last thing we'll ever do. But if we pull hard at lower speeds, it can create a stall situation. We'll talk about that more later. Bottom line, though, is stall speeds increase greatly during turns. It's something we need to always keep in mind.
In this context, somebody give me a couple of synonyms for the word accelerated. I mean, when I teach a student accelerated stalls, in my mind, I'm afraid they're going to equate that with the kind of acceleration that you have when you depart a stop sign in the car. So what are some appropriate synonyms for accelerated?
Non-slow speed.
Say?
Non-slow speed.
Happens at a higher speed.
Change the velocity or direction.
High speed
Okay.
stalls.
It's always going to be a change in direction. Sometimes it might be a lateral direction, sometimes it might be a vertical direction. But it'll be a sudden change in direction.
Yeah, because we don't have the power to create load on the airplane through the use of power.
Probably the easiest way to explain it is the aircraft will stall above the bottom of the white arc. So when they look at the airspeed indicator, you're not going to stall there, you're going to stall over at a higher speed there. And the reason why is because the aircraft is in an accelerated frame of reference.
Okay.
You could also use the term loaded stall. Because the reason it's stalling at a higher airspeed is because the wind is having to produce more lift than the weight of the aircraft.
Does that translate correctly to, when you say loaded stall, does that translate correctly into anything over 1 G?
Yes.
Anything over 1 G, right? In fact, you can go back to that chart here. And you can see that anything, you can see where 1 G is pretty low. You have to get above pretty much 20 or 30 degrees angle of bank to get above 1 G. So for a turning stall, you can see that even the percent increase in stall speed is very low in that regime. So,
And it doesn't necessarily need to be in a turn. This also happens if you're doing a loop, an inside loop, where if you don't have enough speed as you get to the top of that loop, the airplane will stall, and the nose doesn't drop, the airplane just starts falling on its back until you decrease the angle of attack. The recovery is the same. You release back pressure to decrease the angle of attack, and then recover from whatever unusual latitude you end up with.
Yeah, that's consistent here, also pulling up other abrupt changes like that.
Slightly related statement to it's a loaded stall. If you decide to intentionally overload the airplane, what happens to the stall speed? Or if you're quite light relative to the maximum certificated gross weight, what happens to the stall speed? Stall speed is an angle of stall is an angle of attack. It's not necessarily easy.
Well, and the way to look at that is that generally for our aircraft to be under a load, you have to increase the AOA. When you increase the AOA, you're closer to that stall speed, So your stall, actually I said it wrong, you're closer to the critical AOA. So what happens as you load up the airplane is your stall speed just increases to that point where you're at the critical AOA. So it gives you less of a margin over stall speed at the higher angles of attack. Okay, so for those of you that want some proof, here it is. This is taken from a 182T POH, Section 5. You'll find this toward the front of the chapter, and you'll find that stall speed at 3,100 pounds for a 0-degree flap setting is 50 knots. Okay, that sounds about right. But you bank to 60 degrees and you're 71 knots. 72 with the most forward center of gravity. So you can see how quickly that goes up. And then think about how often you may be flying in a regime where you're flying at 70 knots. Right, so 70 knots combined with a bank angle could be a potential issue. So accelerated stalls occur most frequently during inadvertent, improperly executed turns, stall and spin recoveries, pullouts from steep dives, unusual attitudes, upset recovery, when overshooting a base to final turn, pulling too fast on the controls for a power on, off stall entry or recovery, or starting around a flare too early, you pull back on the yoke. Actually, if you're too late on that. So the common thread throughout this is that you're banking, you're slow, and you're hard on the controls. So those things to remember when you're flying in this regime. So with that in mind, when might accelerated stalls be a critical consideration for CAP mission pilots? Not just any pilot, but CAP mission pilots.
Well, we have these things called mountains.
If they get too close, you got to turn.
Yeah,
Okay, good.
that's it.
Good.
That's the whole conversation.
Okay, good. Anything else?
Search patterns.
Good, okay.
So generally, like I said, search pattern, you're flying with 10 degrees of flaps at 90 knots at 1,000 feet, and somebody says, hey, I see something to the right, and you try to circle it. That could be one situation using the accelerated stall.
Okay, good. Ken?
Yeah, I was just going to say, when trying to identify something on the ground, when you're going turns around a point, you might get distracted, change your bank angle, or not have enough power to maintain altitude. You could end up with an accelerated stall.
Okay, good. Anything else? Okay, yeah, so these two came up. So let's say for whatever reason, the IC wants you to fly a half nautical mile spacing for your tracks instead of 1 mile. All right, so now you can't just do a standard rate turn unless you really slow down a lot. So you have to slow down, you have to increase your bank angle. So those are two of the conditions that may lead to a scenario where you might have a problem. And I don't know about you guys, but on occasion I look down at the airspeed indicator and it's a little bit lower than I anticipated. okay? I want, say, 85 to 90 knots, and it's at 80 knots. So things to consider. Contour search, yeah. Yeah, we could be, we're already low. We're already kind of slow. And we may have to turn to avoid some terrain. Anything else?
Turbulence in mountains could create a accelerated storm.
Okay, yeah.
Or even any turbulence.
Yeah.
It can happen.
That could load up the airplane, yeah. That's
So we're
right.
watching this tree dance out here and thinking, if you're out flying in that gust, all of a sudden you're in a much steeper bank than you anticipated and a lot slower.
That's right. I hadn't considered that, but okay. All right, so another one is a canyon turn, right? I consider this to be kind of a pseudo emergency procedure. You find yourself in a situation where you have to reverse course. You know that to reverse course, you need probably one of two things, or both. You need to slow the airplane down to reduce the turn radius. You need to increase the bank angle to reduce the turn radius. So those are some situations that could lead to a potential turning stall if you let the speed decay. And then we talk about some other things. Okay, so this is the easy part. So how do we avoid these turning stalls?
Avoid those things. You just-
Exactly, exactly.
Very good.
All right, speed control. Minimize the bank angle to the extent that you can. Easy on the controls. Reduce the weight of the aircraft because that reduces the stall speed in flying in the mountains. It also reduces the effect on the aircraft due to density altitude to keep the weight down.
But the weight reduces that term, the aircraft's resistance to load factors.
Oh, you're talking VA, okay.
You could, it changes stall speed by minor weight.
Yeah, it lowers everything. It lowers the stall speed and it lowers your VA. That's correct.
And it also creates the possibility that the aircraft could enter an accelerated stall. Because the aircraft is more susceptible to changing vectors, turbulence.
Turbulence could be an issue. The other stuff should also be reduced. For example, the stall speed and VA both are reduced by about a ratio of the actual load versus the max gross weight square root. That's how they change with speed. The bottom line is we need to remember the stalls can occur at higher speeds when the airplane is under a load. Be cognizant of that when you're fast, when you're turning, and when you've got a big bank angle. Okay, another thing we could do, and we're almost done, it looks like we're going to be just about right, is we can learn more by practicing accelerated stalls with CFI. So commercial pilots and CFIs have already had some experience here, but private pilots may not. So grab a CFI, go out, and do some accelerated stalls. So normally we do this by climbing during a steep turn, but there's other ways to do this as well. And Craig, this should look familiar. You brought this up earlier. Select a speed that's greater than your accelerated stall speed, but less than VA. So for a completely loaded C-182, that's between 72 and 110 knots. When you lower the weight of the airplane, those numbers get lowered appropriately. Okay. Also, be careful using flaps. They're limited to 2 Gs. All right. So, in conclusion, turning stalls are accelerated stalls. They occur when the airplane is under load, when you're getting pushed into your seat. They occur at much higher speeds than normal stall speeds do, and they can occur on a typical cap mission. So because of that, we need to be cognizant about aircraft loading, speeds, bank angle, and coordination throughout the flight to prevent this problem. Okay, any questions?
I have a quick question. I have an experience early in my cat flying career where I think I was a fairly new 206 pilot, and for whatever reason I was piloting a jet with it seems like 4 folks in there. We took off from Salt Lake and we're going down south somewhere. By the time we got to North Utah County, I was at about 11,000 feet, very close to level flight, if not. I think it was a hot day, so performance wasn't that good, but I think I was down still at 90 knots, maybe 100. And as I was going along, thinking I was pretty much straight and level, all of a sudden the stall warning went on. So I put the nose down and went away, and eventually got up to a little more speed. But what would cause me to be in, and I haven't thought of this since forever, but that really shocked me and surprised me that I would get a stall warning at that high of a speed in what would typically be straight and level flight.
Well, if you were straight and level, the power was set about where you would expect it to be to maintain that. Was it turbulent? Perhaps?
No, it was not turbulent. It was smooth flight. And that really got my attention. And then
How hot a day was it?
Pardon?
How hot of a day?
I think it was fairly hot. I mean, it wasn't, it's been, this was years and years ago. And I haven't thought of it since then. And maybe there's somebody snoring in the back seat. I thought it was a stall warning. But,
And I can't explain that.
if nothing about it made sense to me, okay, maybe I don't understand something here. But, okay.
Kim?
I had a similar situation. I was ferrying an Apache from Oklahoma to California. And I'm passing over some of the higher elevations in Arizona, and it's July. And I'm flying along, and I cross a ridge line, and all of a sudden, she just starts to sink. And I was like at 12,500, I was in a vehicle, and all of a sudden, she just starts to sink. And thankfully, I had a couple of turbos, one of which was in on, but I was able to pull the other one in and at least stop the sink. And I think what it was as I crossed this ridge line, there was a difference in temperature. I didn't have any turbulence, but the associated density altitude change, all of a sudden my performance just fell off a cliff. And that's the only thing I can think of that might be similar to what you experience, is just if the density altitude changes like that.
Well, were you in the mountains?
I was in mountainous terrain. It was hot and it was very irregular mountainous terrain. It was like high desert, but with valleys and stuff like that.
It could have even been a downdraft.
It could have been a downdraft too. I mean, it definitely got my attention.
It was almost certainly mountain lighter.
Okay.
As glider pilots, we love it, but you want to be on the uphill side of it.
I was not.
Because on the other side, it gets real exciting.
Yeah.
The charts up here.
I don't know if this will be done in another presentation, but about once a quarter in an evaluation, it's usually private pilot, but I've seen it in CAP pilots too. We're practicing or we're demonstrating a power off stall. I'm sorry, a power on stall. We're at a high deck angle. Stall warning comes on. One wing drops, and suddenly we're going round and round and round. Why is that, Scott? And what do you do about it?
Part of it could be coordination that took you from a stall condition to a spin condition.
Ah. So CFI check pilots, please be aware that a 182 will spin. It's not certificated for it. So if it starts in that direction, please, we talked earlier, when do you jump in? Pretty early. I've seen it 3 times on Cat 4 and 5s. All 3 of them, curiously, were at night. I don't do 4 and 5s at night anymore.
Wow.
I'm starting to get that look now. Was there any other quick questions? Okay, appreciate it.
Lance had one.
To go along with the stall stuff, before I had soloed, when I was doing accelerated stalls with my instructor in 152, south of solid number 2, I'm in a left turn, and I'm uncoordinated because I hadn't learned this yet. We stalled, that thing snapped.
Yep.
and it snapped fast. He was recovering as we were doing this. He recovered and came back out. And I go, what just happened? And he goes, oh, you were entering a spin. He explained it to me, which is good. After, of course, I soloed and did a couple of that. He asked me, what would you like to do? And I go, spins. And we went out over the Great Salt Lake, climbed way up, spun down, went back up. But we spent an hour and a half doing spins. I've never been scared of a spin since because of that. But man, that scared me. That one little thing. And all I do is when we're doing power on stalls, the thing I watch that little ball to make sure. As long as it's centered, I'm okay. I'm safe.
And I think most of us have a story like that.
Yeah. So the first thing that has to be in your brain and in your muscle memory about stalls and approaches to spins is a stall is angle of attack. And so reducing angle of attack is the number one thing to stopping a stall. So when that happens, if you don't reduce the angle of attack, give it a spin. If you reduce the angle of attack, at least things are going to recover. You can stop it. You can then roll. You can then do other things, but you've got to reduce the angle of attack. Same thing with power failures on climb. Same thing with, it's all angle of attack.
That's the first step you take.
And when you reduce the angle of attack, you get to use your ailerons. High angle of attack, you can't. Low angle of attack, you could be doing 20 knots. If you lower that angle of attack, you have full aileron control.
Exactly.
Little applause for Scott May. We got some great news.